Police have fired rubber bullets and water cannon against student protesters in Turkey's capital, Ankara. Demonstrations began last week after the arrest of Istanbul's mayor, Ekrem Imamoglu. Turkey's crackdown on domestic dissent has been met with criticism by the international community, including the European Union. But so far, the EU has taken no action against Turkey or President Erdogan.
The streets of Istanbul earlier this week. A widespread crackdown on opposition protests has prompted criticism from European officials, mixed with caution.
We want Turkey to remain anchored to Europe, but this requires a clear commitment to democratic norms and practices.
As a Council of Europe member that Turkey is and an EU candidate country, Turkey must uphold the democratic values.
Talks with Turkey under the circumstances might be very difficult. We have some cost objectives, we have some common challenges, especially in security issues.
Common challenges are why talk hasn't been accompanied by action from Europe. While EU membership talks have stalled, Turkey still has a lot to offer. That's allowed Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan to defy domestic critics while establishing himself as an increasingly essential player on the international stage. Turkey plays key roles in at least 3 major issues for Europe. Ankara has been a key host for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Turkey also has a deal with Europe not to allow migrants into Greece and to accept migrants sent back by Europe. And it's a key player in Syria, which Europe wants to see stabilized after a revolution last year. With trust in the U.S. commitment to European security in doubt, Turkey's military power is also important. It has the second biggest standing military force in the NATO alliance after the U.S. Europe has no interest in alienating such a powerful military player. Washington is also interested in Turkey and received Turkey's foreign minister this week, part of moves by both sides to shore up ties after years of drifting apart. Ankara wants relief from sanctions and renewed defense cooperation. The U.S. wants Turkey's help to strike a peace deal on Russia and Ukraine, and Turkey's influence in Syria and Central Asia could also be an asset. With Europe navigating major geopolitical shifts, Turkey's made itself indispensable, so anything more than criticism of its domestic affairs is unlikely for now.
All right, let's get more from DW correspondent Rosie Prashad in Brussels. Rosie, the EU wants Turkey to, quote, uphold democratic values, but it appears to have little leverage to ensure Turkey does so, doesn't it?
Well, look, it has leverage on paper, at least. The EU is by far Turkey's largest trading partner, and Turkey also has clear political goals when it comes to the European Union. If you talk to officials and EU diplomats in Brussels, they will tell you Turkey's long-standing membership bid, its desire to join this bloc, is at a total standstill. But it's a very different story if you talk to Turkish diplomats. They've been on a mission to try and improve ties between Turkey and the EU, and it had been working. In 2025, we really saw President Erdogan and Turkey on a whole as on a kind of diplomatic high. And I think that geopolitical might that Turkey's been wielding is so key to why we've seen the EU basically looking at using its leverage with a lot of caution. And now I should say we have had some more outspoken criticism from EU capitals, for example, from Germany, but also from France, that has said that what's going on in Turkey are simply attacks on democracy. But overall, what experts told me is that they see there is a gulf between the gravity of the situation in Turkey and what they see as a caution in the EU's response so far.
There seems to also be a sort of a rapprochement between the United States and Turkey. Erdogan and Trump both had a phone conversation. Does this somewhat influence the EU's attitude towards Ankara as well?
I think it's definitely playing on the EU officials' minds as they plot their next move here. One analyst I spoke to told me that he thinks there's really a kind of competition going on to charm Turkey between the United States and the European Union, and that President Erdogan knows that very well. Given the massive geopolitical upheavals that the European continent has been going through, and especially given the future of Ukraine and the continent's security, which really seems to hang in the balance, there's a sense that European Union diplomats and officials don't really want to be using this as a moment to lose any friends. But of course, what campaigners would say, well, is at what cost?
You said earlier that at least on paper, it appears that the EU can exert more pressure on Turkey. Is there any way practically that the EU can exert more pressure?
Well, you can be sure that pressure to exert more pressure is going to mount, especially from the likes of European mayors. They're going to be gathering in Strasbourg. They're expected to really call for tougher action. We can expect something similar from elected EU lawmakers when they meet in Strasbourg next week. And of course, not least also from campaigners. For example, the Amnesty Human Rights Organisation sent me a statement in which they said that EU platitudes must be matched with more action. One thing to keep an eye on in the short term, there are expected to be some political talks between Turkish officials and EU officials in the coming weeks. They're not at a particularly high level, but they're seen as very important by Ankara because it's a sign of that rapprochement that it's been working for. So far, the EU has said it has no plans in terms of cancelling or delaying those, but that is definitely one to watch in terms of potential future action.
DW correspondent Rosie Bashar in Brussels. Thanks very much.